Hi class, today we're going to talk about chapter 2 from Story of the World, Egyptians Lived on the Nile River. In this video, we're going to be reviewing chapter 2, talking about King Narmer and the first dynasty of Egypt, and briefly discussing gods of ancient Egypt. So to begin, we're going to review the first section in chapter 2 that talks about the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in Africa. It floods every year, and the Nile Delta is the most fertile area in that region. Here is a picture of the Nile River, and here's a map of the Nile River. So you also learn that the Nile River flows from south to north, and therefore southern Egypt was referred to by the ancient Egyptians as Upper Egypt, and northern Egypt was referred to as Lower Egypt. Now, if you're having a hard time remembering that, because I know that can get really complicated, try using alliteration and remember that the Nile flows north. So just like in the Fertile Crescent, where we have the Sumerians settling between the Tigris and Euphrates River, we have two Egyptian tribes settling in around the Nile. The Lower Egyptians had a king wearing the red crown. The Upper Egyptians had a king wearing the white crown. In Upper Egypt, in the south, we have a king named Narmer, and he defeats the Lower Egyptian king wearing the red crown, and he becomes the king of all of Egypt. He takes the white crown and the red crown, puts them together, and he wears the double crown of Egypt, signifying that he is the ruler of all of Egypt. So let's talk about King Narmer. But before we do that, let's backtrack a little bit and talk about what happened before Narmer, so we have a little context. So before Narmer, when you're studying Egyptian history, the time period before him is known as pre-dynastic Egypt, and this is early Egyptian history prior to or before 3000 BC. If you recall from our first video, I mentioned that 3000 BC is when we start to have written records. So before we have written records, that time period is known as pre-dynastic Egypt, and it's divided up by archaeologists into different time periods, but that's not really important for us to study because remember, we want to start where story emerges, where story begins, and that's when we start having writing around 3000 BC. And that's where we're going to start because King Narmer ruled around 3100 BC. He was known, and I think this is so great, he was known as the raging catfish because a catfish was thought to be the bravest, most aggressive fish. Now, if somebody called you a raging catfish now, you probably take it as an insult. I would take it as an insult. But back then, this was a compliment of the highest honor. I just think that's so great. King Narmer is the first human king on the Egyptian king list. If you can recall from the second section of chapter 2 that you read, typically the gods were thought to be the creators and the rulers of Egypt, and then it became a human task, and Narmer is the first human king on the Egyptian king list, and he begins the first dynasty of Egypt. This picture right here that you can see is the Narmer palette, where you have Narmer conquering the other king and uniting Egypt. Here's a timeline for you. So as you can see, pre-dynastic Egypt is before King Narmer. It's prehistory. Then you have King Narmer beginning the first dynasty of Egypt around 3100 BC. So what is the significance of King Narmer? King Narmer, I think this is pretty cool, was the first known empire builder. So just to kind of give you a refresher on what an empire is, when you have a country like the United States, you typically have one leader, like we have a president, and that's kind of it. Unless you start expanding your territory and you conquer other countries, kind of like Germany in World War II, and you start building an empire. So when you have more than one country under your rule, that is considered an empire, and King Narmer was the first known empire builder. Okay, so now we're going to talk about gods of ancient Egypt, and I'm going going to read you this quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica because I think it's a great description of ancient Egyptian gods. And it says, Egypt had one of the largest and most complex pantheons of gods of any civilization in the ancient world. Over the course of Egyptian history, hundreds of gods and goddesses were worshipped. The characteristics of individual gods could be hard to pin down. Most had a principal association, for example, with the sun or the underworld, and form. But these could change over time as gods rose and fell in importance and evolved in ways that corresponded to development in Egyptian society. So, needless to say, it would take a very long time to explain all of this to you. However, I found a great video called Egyptian Gods Explained in 13 Minutes. I'm going to link it below. Watch that and you'll get a great overview and understanding of ancient Egyptian gods. So do that and I'll see you next time.